On a rented kitchen counter in New Orleans, at 4 o'clock in the morning, three things sat side by side beneath a single fluorescent bulb. There was a six-tier wedding cake, flawless, worth more than its maker took home in a month. There was a thin white envelope holding $900 in cash, and there was a lease deposit notice for $3,742.50, due that Monday at 9 like sharp. The woman who built that cake earned $13.25 an hour at a grocery store bakery. The family who refused to pay her had just spent $500,000 in a wedding. They were certain her silence meant surrender. They were certain a poor black woman with sugar on her sleeves would take the scraps and slip out the service door. What none of them knew was that the quiet man in the worn gray coat, the one she poured free chicory coffee for every Tuesday without once asking his name, was about to walk into a ballroom full of senators and billionaires and say a single sentence that would change her life. This is the story of how she lost everything by noon and got all of it back before midnight. Before we go any further, stay with me, because this is more than a story. It is a reminder of what dignity looks like when no one is clapping yet. If you are watching from somewhere out there tonight, do me a small favor and tell me in the comments where you are sitting and what the clock says where you are right now. And if you have ever had to swallow your pride to keep your lights on, if you believe the quietest person in the room is on the strongest one, subscribe to this channel so a story like this never passes you by. Octavia Toussaint went by Tavi to the few people in New Orleans who still knew her, and at the Boku Market on Claiborne Avenue, almost nobody did. She clocked in every weeknight at 11 light and clocked out at 7:30 in the morning when the day crew arrived smelling of cigarettes and fabric softener, already complaining about the heat. The fluorescent lights above the bakery counter buzzed at a pitch she alone still seemed to hear, a thin electric whine that lived underneath the hum of the walk-in coolers. She had learned to work inside that sound, the way a person learns to sleep beside a highway. The store sold quarter-sheet cakes in plastic clamshells, $11.99 each, frosted in colors that did not exist anywhere in nature. Tavi iced 32 of them a night, sometimes more, with a piping bag held in a grip that had once been insured for more than her car was worth. Her hands knew things this job would never ask of them. They knew how to fold gum paste into petals thin enough for light to pass through, how to coax melted isomalt into the translucent curve of a magnolia, how to read the humidity in a room by the way the sugar fought the warmth of her palm. The work paid $13.25 an hour. The talent in those hands was worth 1,000 times that, and she carried the difference quietly, the way she carried everything. 11 years earlier, she had stood in a very different kitchen. She had been the executive pastry chef at Petit Bayou Pâtisserie, a narrow jewel box of a shop on Magazine Street where the wait list for a wedding cake ran 4 months deep. She had trained the hard way and then the harder way, first under a Creole grandmother who baked for the old downtown churches, then under a Swiss perfectionist who made her cry twice and made her excellent forever. For 9 years, the name Octavia Toussaint meant something in this city. Then her mother got sick. Erlene Toussaint had raised Tavi alone in a shotgun double in the 7th Ward, on a school cafeteria salary and a faith that filled the gaps money could not. When the diagnosis came, stage 4, the doctors spoke in soft voices and long odds. Erlene spent her last 19 days in a hospice room with a window that looked out on a live oak, and Tavi learned the thing that working families always learn too late. Hospice care eases the leaving, but it does not erase the bills that pile up in the months before it. Medical debt is the single largest source of personal bankruptcy filings in America, and most of the people drowning in it had insurance the whole time. By the time the funeral repast was cleared from the church hall, Tavi owed $41,000 she did not have. She did the math the only way she knew how. She sold the ovens, the marble slab, the proofing cabinets, the name itself. Petit Bayou closed on a Tuesday with no announcement, and she paid down what she could and signed a plan for the rest. 3 years of night shifts later, the balance had fallen to 19,012 ones, and the dream had narrowed to a single stubborn point of light. The light had a name. Magnolia and Marrow, the bakery she meant to open in a vacant storefront 6 blocks from where Petit Bayou used to stand. She had walked past that empty window for 2 years, picturing the cases, the glass, the smell of brown butter at dawn. The landlord wanted a deposit of $3,742.50 to hold the lease, and the deadline he had given her was 9 Lathu the coming Monday morning. She was $300 short and 4 days away, and she prayed about it the way Erlene had taught her, plainly, without bargaining. There was one customer at the Boku Market she never failed to notice. He came in most Tuesday mornings just before her shift ended, an older man in a worn gray coat that had been expensive a long time ago, and he always asked for chicory coffee from the little self-serve station nobody else bothered to keep stocked. The morning cashiers looked straight through him. They saw the frayed cuffs and the quiet manner and decided he was nobody worth the courtesy. Tavi saw a man who reminded her of the deacons from her mother's church, and she kept the chicory hot for him, and she remembered that he took it black with one sugar. She did not do it because he mattered. She did it because that was simply how she had been raised to treat people, the man in the gray coat, and the woman who counted out her groceries in dimes, and the teenager mopped her near closing. Dignity, Erlene used to say, is not something you spend only on the people who can pay you back. So Tavi gave it away for free, every night, to a store full of strangers who never learned her name. The call came on a Wednesday, a little after 8 in the morning, as she was untying her apron to go home. It was Yvette Lemoine, a woman who had ordered a christening cake from Petit Bayou years ago and never forgotten the taste of it. Yvette ran in circles Tavi had long since fallen out of, and she had a favor that sounded like a gift. A wealthy family in the Garden District needed a wedding cake on short notice, the Rutherfords, and Yvette had given them one name. Tavi listened to the details with a pressed heart against her ear. 7 tiers, botanical sugarwork, a Saturday delivery. The total came to 7,485s, with half required up front to secure the date. She did the arithmetic before Yvette finished the sentence, and the number landed in her chest like a key turning in a lock. Half of $7,485, $3,742.50. It was, to the penny, the deposit that would save Magnolia and Marrow. She said yes before she let herself wonder why a family that rich would hire a baker that nobody. 3 miles and an entire world away from the Baku market, on the 14th floor of a glass tower with his own name etched into the lobby stone, Terence Callasy sat alone in an office that cost more to cool than most families earned in a year. He was 58 years old, and he owned the Esplanade Royale and 11 other hotels strung along the Gulf Coast like a string of pearls. Callaway Hospitality Group employed just over 4,000 people, and Terence had slowly come to understand a hard truth about all of them. Not one would ever tell him an honest thing again. He had not always lived up here in the cold light. He had come up in a rented half of a shotgun house in Tremé, the son of a longshoreman and a woman who took in laundry, and he had boozed tables at a French Quarter hotel at an age he no longer admitted out loud. He learned the business from the floor up, the way you learn a thing you cannot afford to fail at. He bought his first rundown in at 34 and never stopped, and somewhere along the climb, the boy from Tremé got buried under the man in the bespoke suit. The only person who had ever kept that boy alive was Delphine. His wife had been a schoolteacher when he met her, sharp and unimpressed by his money because she had her own ideas about what made a man worth marrying. She made chicory coffee every single morning of their 29 years together, black with one sugar, and she used the proceeds of his success to build something she actually believed in. The Crescent Children's Foundation put music programs and reading tutors into schools across Orleans Parish, and Terence funded it without ever once asking for his name on the door. 2 years ago, a stroke took her in the time it takes to cross a room. After Delphine died, the tower got very quiet. The board members smiled and agreed with everything he said. The charity galas filled with people who shook his hand and studied his face for weakness. He stopped being able to tell who was kind and who was simply calculating the angle, and that uncertainty began to rot something inside him. So he started disappearing on Tuesday mornings. He would leave the driver behind, pull an old gray coat from the back of a closet, and drive himself to a grocery store on Claiborne Avenue, where the self-serve station kept a pot of chicory coffee that tasted almost exactly like Delphine's. Nobody there knew his name or his net worth. The cashiers looked past him the way people look past the old and the worn, and he found a strange peace in being invisible again. There was only one person in that fluorescent-lit place who ever truly saw him, a tired woman behind the bakery counter who kept his coffee hot and remembered that he took one sugar, and who spoke to him like he was somebody's deacon and not a stranger to be hurried along. He did not know her name. He had simply started to think of her as the proof that decency still existed somewhere. He had no idea that Tuesday that her name was Octavia Toussaint. He had no idea that within the week their two worlds would collide inside a tent in the Garden District. The tasting was held on Thursday afternoon at the Rutherford Estate, a great white columned house off St. Charles Avenue that announced old money before you reached the gate. Up close, though, Tavi noticed the things the photographs would never show. The paint near the cornices had begun to gray and lift. A long crack ran through the marble of the front steps, patched once and patched poorly. The grandeur was real, but it was wearing thin at the edges, the way a coat wears thin before its owner is willing to admit it. Adelaide Rutherford received her in a sitting room that smelled of lilies and lemon polish. She was a woman of perhaps 60, wrapped in the invisible armor of people who have never once been told no, and her daughter Caroline, the bride, sat beside her scrolling through a phone with a diamond on her hand that could have cleared Tavi's debt twice over. Adelaide's eyes did the scan the moment Tavi entered. That swift practice sweep from her shoes to her natural hair and back, the silent arithmetic of whether this woman belonged. Tavi had felt that look 1,000 times. She kept her spine straight and her face calm and let it pass through her like weather. She presented 3 of her finest creations on a tray she had carried in herself: a brown butter genoise layered with fig, a chocolate ganache cut with Creole cream cheese, a praline shard that snapped like glass. Adelaide and Caroline ate in a silence broken only by the soft tick of a grandfather clock. When Adelaide finally set down her fork, she dabbed the corner of her mouth with a monogram napkin and offered a smile that never reached her eyes. "These are surprisingly sophisticated," Adelaide said, the compliment shaped like a blade. "Tell me, did you learn all this from your grandmother down the bayou somewhere?" The room seemed to hold its breath. It was an old move, delivered with the ease of a woman who had spent her whole life keeping people she considered lesser inside their assigned boxes. She was erasing Magazine Street and the Swiss Perfectionist and the 9 years the name Toussaint had meant something, reducing a classically trained chef to a warm caricature in a borrowed kitchen. Tavi did not flinch and did not point to anything. She simply let the silence stretch a beat too long, until Adelaide had to sit inside the discomfort of her own question. And then she answered evenly that her foundations came from Paris-trained masters and the rest she had built herself. Caroline pushed the contract across the table without looking up. Tavi read every line, signed where the deposit was acknowledged, and felt that old cold instinct stir at the base of her skull. It was the way Adelaide pressed the pin, the dismissive tilt of her chin, the faint pedestrian hiding under all that polish. Some quiet voice told her this family had no intention of honoring the balance. As Yvette had mentioned in passing, the Rutherfords were hosting their reception the same Saturday the Crescent Foundation held its annual gala across town. The gala a man in a gray coat quietly paid for every year. Tavi noted the coincidence and thought nothing of it. She had a cake to build. Saturday arrived hot and wet, the kind of New Orleans June morning that makes sugar feep and buttercream slump if you give it the chance. By 6, Tavi had the 7 tiers loaded into a rented refrigerated van. The cargo hold locked at a steady 62 degrees, her assistant Andre riding shotgun with a cooler of backup sugar flowers across his knees. She had spent the first half of the Rutherford payment the moment it cleared. Most of it had gone into the cake itself, the isomalt and gum paste and imported vanilla, the van rental, Andre's wages, and what was left she had thrown at an overdue line on the hospice plan. The balance due on delivery, another $3,742.50, was the money that would make Monday's lease. She had cut it that close on purpose, because cutting it close was the only way the math ever worked for people like her. The Rutherford reception was being held under a glass-paneled marquee on the back lawn, a tent that cost more than Tavi's annual salary, with the Mississippi sliding by gray and patient beyond the live oaks. For 2 hours, she and Andre built the cake on site, because a 7-tier structure is not baking so much as architecture. She trimmed the edible lace with a surgical blade. She set each ivory sugar magnolia with fine tweezers, angling the petals so the afternoon light would catch them and hold. As her hands worked, her mind went where it always went when the labor turned to instinct. It went to the women she came from. Long before the Civil War, this city had been full of free people of color, the gens de couleur libres, and a great many of them were artisans of the highest order, ironworkers and seamstresses and confectioners whose work filled the grandest houses on these very avenues. The praline itself, the sugar and pecan candy tourists now buy on Royal Street, was carried into being by women of color who sold it from baskets to feed their families. They built the sweet tooth of New Orleans and were quietly written out of its cookbooks. Tavi knew she stood at the end of that long, erased line. When Adelaide Rutherford had asked about her grandmother down the bayou, she had meant it as a smallness. She had not understood she was naming a dynasty. The cake stood 4 feet tall when Tavi peeled off her gloves, a towering monument of botanical sugarwork, flawless from any angle. That was when the air in the tent shifted. The rustle of silk and the sharp click of heels announced them. Before they appeared, Caroline already sealed into a custom gown, Adelaide gliding behind her with a glass of champagne and a face arranged into calm. Adelaide did not gasp. She did not offer one word of praise. She began a slow, deliberate orbit of the table, studying the tiers the way an appraiser studies a flaw he means to exploit. And then she stopped and tapped a manicured nail against her chin. "It is not quite what we pictured, is it?" she murmured, her gaze pinned to the middle tier. "The flowers are heavy. The whole thing reads a little urban for an estate like ours. We wanted something that breathed old-world nobility, and this feels, well, aggressive." The word urban hung in the humid air, ugly and unmistakable beneath its thin veil of taste. It was a dog whistle blown at full volume, and they both knew it. Adelaide reached into her handbag and produced not a check for the $3,742.50 she owed, but a thin white envelope, which she set on the edge of the linen without offering it into Tavi's hand. "There is $900 in there," she said, her voice flat as a closing door. "That is more than fair for something that misses the mark this badly. You will take it, of course, because we both know you cannot drag a 4-foot cake back out of here without making a spectacle of yourself in front of my entire vendor team." She turned her back before Tavi could answer, already calling to the florist about the centerpieces, certain the matter was closed. She had read the situation exactly as her kind always did. She had seen a tired black woman in a stained chef's coat, a woman clearly one missed payment from ruin, and she had calculated that desperation would do her bargaining for her. She believed Tavi's pride was chained to the cake. She had no idea that pride for Tavi had never lived in the sugar. Tavi did not raise her voice. She did not reach for the envelope. What she did instead in the long second while Adelaide's back was turned was slide her phone from her apron pocket and quietly press record, propping it against a flower box so the lens took in the whole scene. It captured the envelope on the linen. It captured Adelaide walking away without ever tendering the balance. It captured the timestamp running in the corner like a slow, patient witness. Then Tavi looked at Andre, whose eyes were wide with alarm, and she said the only word the moment required. "We dismantle. It takes 2 hours to assemble a botanical cake. It takes 14 minutes to take one apart." They moved like a tactical crew. Andre brought the reinforced boxes from the van, while Tavi separated the tiers with her offset spatula, lifting each heavy round into its sterile case, unpinning the magnolia Adelaide had called too urban and nesting them in foam. The florist dropped a bundle of roses. A lighting tech nearly fell off his ladder. In the world of elite weddings, a vendor calmly tearing down her own masterpiece was a thing that simply did not happen, and the whole tent stopped to watch it happen. By the time the last base tier slid into the van, the platform where the centerpiece was meant to stand held nothing but an empty stretch of ivory linen and a white envelope with $900 inside it. Tavi shut the doors and the thud echoed across the manicured lawn. She had 2 hours and 45 minutes before 400 guests would arrive expecting a royal dessert, and she did not intend to be anywhere near this address when they did. In the cab, hands steady on the wheel, she dialed Yvette Lemoine. "I have a 7-tier botanical cake riding cold in the back of my van," she said, "and a sudden notion about where it belongs tonight." Yvette laughed in disbelief and told her the Crescent Foundation Gala would clear its loading dock in 15 minutes. Tavi pulled on to St. Charles, the streetcar rattling past in the other direction, and pointed the van toward the only room in this city that had ever known what her hands were worth. At 9 sharp, back beneath the Rutherford marquee, the moment everyone had waited for arrived, and there was no cake. The fillet had been cleared. The band shifted into the soft, expectant tempo that always precedes the cutting of a towering confection beneath a single spotlight. Instead, the catering staff emerged from the prep tents carrying broad silver trays, and on those trays sat squares of aggressively yellow sponge and waxy, hypersweet frosting, the kind sold in clamshells at a discount grocery and meant for a child's birthday on paper plates. They had been driven in from 3 different supermarkets within the last 90 minutes. They were plated on gold-rimmed Limoges. The silence that fell over the tent was not respectful. It was the sharp, collective intake of breath that comes right before a scandal finds its legs. 400 of the most judgmental guests on St. Charles Avenue took one polite bite of chemical vanilla and set their forks down, and the whispering began behind linen napkins. Someone murmured that the Rutherfords had bounced a check to the florist. Someone else had heard the estate was quietly listed for sale, that the old money had run dry years ago, and only the address remained. Caroline sat at the sweetheart table with tears cutting through her makeup, while Adelaide stared at the cheap sponge as though it might detonate, feeling her social standing evaporate in real time. She had to bet everything on the certainty that a poor woman would fold. She had not counted on a woman who knew exactly what her own work was worth. 3 miles away, under the frescoed ceiling of Rosewater Hall, a very different evening was reaching its peak. At 9:30, the lights dimmed and a single pool of warm illumination opened on the polished floor, and Tavi's cake was wheeled out on a mirrored cart. A murmur rippled through the room, not of scandal, but of pure, unguarded awe. The isomalt petals caught the light and seemed to glow from within, the edible lace impossibly fine, the whole structure standing like an ivory monument to a kind of patience the people in that room rarely witnessed and could not buy. Yvette Lemoine stepped to the podium and tapped the microphone once. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, her voice carrying through the historic hall, "it is my honor to present a breathtaking gift donated to our foundation just hours ago. A true work of culinary architecture by the visionary behind it, Chef Octavia Toussaint. The applause was not polite. It was a roar, rising as the room rose. 500 senators and surgeons and legacy matriarchs coming to their feet, while the society photographers' flashbulbs went off like summer lightning. Tavi stood near the velvet rope at the edge of the kitchen, her hands folded loosely behind her back, watching a room she had been priced out of for 3 years stand up for the work of her hands. She did not smile for them. She simply let herself feel it, once all the way down. That was when a man stepped out of the crowd and walked toward her, and she knew the walk before she could make out the face. The worn gray coat was gone. In its place was a tailored midnight tuxedo that fit him the way only real money fits. But the eyes were the same, and the careful, unhurried way of moving was the same. And when he stopped in front of her, she understood with a small electric shock exactly who her Tuesday customer had been all along. She glanced down at the program, still folded in her hand. The evening was underwritten by the Callaway Hospitality Group, hosted in loving memory of Delphine Callaway.
You keep your chicory hot for strangers.
Terence Callaway said quietly, and you make this with the same hands. He shook his head slowly, like a man rearranging his whole understanding of a thing. For 2 years, I drove to that store to feel like a person instead of a checkbook. I never knew the one decent soul in the building was the best pastry chef in this city. Tavi could not speak for a moment. She had treated him like somebody's deacon because he had looked like one, never once suspecting the coat, hit a man who could buy the whole garden district and never feel it. Neither of them reached for anything. There was nothing romantic in the air between them and never would be, only the quiet recognition of two people who had each, without knowing it, shown the other something true. It was then, standing in that warm column of light, that Tavi's composure finally bent. She slipped 2 fingers into her wallet and touched the folded square of paper she carried everywhere, the last letter her mother had written from the hospice bed by the window with the live oak. She did not need to unfold it. She had read it so many times the words lived in her chest, written in Erlene's careful schoolteacher hand in the final week of her life. They will try to make where we come from sound small. Baby, the letter said. Your grandmother sold pralines off a basket down in Terrebonne Parish, and there will always be someone with a fine name who says that like it should shame you. But that woman fed people. That woman built something out of sugar and nothing, the way her mother did before her. Down the bayou is not a smallness, Octavia. It is a crown. You wear it every time you put your hands to the work. Adelaide Rutherford had asked, with all her practiced cruelty, whether Tavi had learned her craft from her grandmother down the bayou. She had meant to make her small. She had no way of knowing she had reached straight past the insult and named the exact lineage, the exact dynasty, that Tavi wore like a crown. Across town, the old money was choking on supermarket frosting and the ashes of its own reputation. Here, in a room full of the people the Rutherfords had spent their lives trying to impress, a woman who earned $13.25 an hour was being canonized for the very heritage they had tried to use as a weapon. The man in the gray coat had seen it first weeks ago in a single cup of chicory coffee, and he was not finished yet. Before Tavi left the gala Saturday night, Terence Callaway pressed a heavy embossed card into her hand and asked if she would come see him Monday. She thanked him and slipped the card into her apron, but she made no promises. She had spent 3 years climbing out of a hole, and she had learned to be wary of rich men bearing sudden interest. A gift with a string attached was just a leash by a prettier name. She would need her wits about her by Monday for an entirely different reason. At 9:15 that morning, while she was steaming milk in her cramped kitchen and watching the clock crawl toward the lease deadline, a courier knocked. He left a stiff cardboard envelope from a white shoe firm in the Central Business District, the kind that handles discreet divorces for people with too much to hide. Inside was a cease and desist letter on heavy cream paper. The Rutherfords were demanding $42,000 in damages, the surrender of all photos and video, and a signed written apology for what they called the malicious sabotage of a private wedding. It was a masterclass in performative victimhood, engineered to bully a small business owner into panic silence. Tavi set the letter beside her coffee and felt her pulse stay exactly where it was. She had no money for a corporate attorney, no retainer, no firm of her own on speed dial. What she had was a folder, and people like the Rutherfords never understood the quiet power of a woman who keeps a folder. She drove to a storefront legal aid office in Central City and sat across a metal desk from Patrice Boudreau, a community attorney with reading glasses pushed up into her locks and a stack of files that never seemed to shrink. Patrice read the letter twice, then set it down and almost smiled. They are bluffing, she said, and they are bluffing badly. Then she explained the thing that people count on poor people never learning. In Louisiana, Patrice said, you do not need a lawyer to fight this. and you do not need one to file your own claim either. Disputes under $5,000 can go to small claims through the Justice of the Peace and City courts, where ordinary people argue their own cases without spending a dime on counsel. Text messages are evidence. A signed deposit acknowledgement is evidence, and a timestamp video of someone walking away from a contract without paying is just about the cleanest evidence there is. They are not going to sue you, Octavia. They are terrified you will sue them, and worse, that you will do it in public. Tavi opened the folder. Inside was the contract with Caroline's signature acknowledging the $7,485 total and the balance due on delivery. There was the text thread where Adelaide had confirmed the order and the terms in her own words. And there was the video, 2 minutes and 11 seconds of Adelaide setting down a $900 envelope, refusing the balance, and turning her back, the timestamp ticking in the corner the whole time. Tavi had not built a case for revenge. She had simply kept her streets, the way her mother kept every church bulletin and every paid utility stub in a shoebox under the bed, because dignity, in a world that doubts you, is partly a matter of documentation. Patrice typed a single-page response that afternoon. She attached a still frame from the video and a copy of the signed contract, and she informed the Rutherfords firm, politely and without heat, that her clients prepared to file in small claims for the unpaid balance of $3,742.50 and to let the public record speak for itself. She noted that any continued harassment would be met with a counterclaim and that the witnesses, the florist, the planner, the catering crew, were all a subpoena away. The reply came at 2:15 that same day. It was 2 lines long. The threat was withdrawn, and a wire for the full balance of $3,742.50 would clear by end of business, on the sole condition that the matter remained private. The Rutherfords had chosen the silence of their own shame over the daylight, because daylight would have shown the whole city that the old money was gone and only the columns remained. Tavi had called her landlord that morning and asked him to hold the lease until 4. The wire cleared at 3:40. She made the deposit on Magnolia and Marrow with 20 minutes to spare, and she did it with the exact money Adelaide Rutherford had sworn she would never see. Only then, with the dream secured by her own hand, did she drive to the Esplanade Royale to see Terence Calloway. He met her not in a boardroom, but in the hotel's quiet tea lounge. 2 cups of chicory coffee already poured, black with 1 sugar. He did not offer her a favor. He offered her a contract. Calloway Hospitality was restructuring the culinary program across all 12 properties, he said, and he had spent 6 months looking for factory talent with exactly the architectural precision the entire gala had risen to its feet for. He wanted her name, he wanted Magnolia and Marrow as the exclusive dessert vendor for every Calloway property on the Gulf Coast, with a multi-year retainer in the capital to build the shop out properly. Tavi listened, and when he finished, she set down her cup. "I appreciate it, Mr. Calloway," she said, "but I do not take charity, and I do not want a thing I did not earn. If this is pity dressed up in a contract, I will finish my coffee and thank you for it and go." Terence Calloway looked at her for a long moment, and something moved behind his eyes that had not moved in 2 years. "It is not pity," he said. "I came off a longshoreman's wages in Tremé. My wife sold the idea that people are worth more than their bank balance, and she spent her whole life proving it before she ran out of time to keep proving it. I am not offering you a handout. I am offering you a deal, because you are the best in this city, and because I would be a fool to let the Rutherfords of the world keep a talent like yours hidden behind a grocery store counter. Earn it. That is the only way I would ever want you to have it." Tavi extended her hand across the table, and they shook on it, 2 people from the same kind of street who had each climbed out by a different road. There was nothing romantic in it. There was only respect, which between the right 2 people is the rarer and the stronger thing. Magnolia and Marrow opened on a bright Saturday in October on the very stretch of Magazine Street Tavi had walked past for 2 years, with her dream pressed flat against the glass. The gold leaf lettering she had pictured 1,000 times was finally there, catching the morning sun, and the smell of brown butter and toasting pecans rolled out the propped front door, rolled the sun onto the sidewalk before the sun was up. There was a line by 7 lights. Half of them had no idea they were standing outside the shop of the woman whose cake had brought Rosewater Hall to its feet, and the other half had come precisely because they did. Yvette Lamont was first through the door that opening morning, and she did not order a thing at first. She simply stood in the middle of the little shop, with one hand pressed to her chest, looking at the cases full of work that had so nearly died behind a grocery store counter. And she told Tavi that a few things in this city were finally being set right. Then she bought 24 pralines, paid double, and would not hear a single word about the change. The Calloway contract turned out to be everything Terence had promised and nothing she had not earned. Magnolia and Marrow became the exclusive dessert house for all Gulf Coast properties, and the steady retainer did what 3 years of night shifts never could. Within 4 months, Tavi made the final payment on her mother's medical debt. She did it on a Tuesday morning, alone in the back office before the ovens were even hot, watching the balance of $19,412 drop to a clean and final zero on the screen. She did not celebrate. She simply pressed her palm flat to the desk, closed her eyes, and said thank you out loud to a woman who had been gone 3 years. Because some debts you pay with money, and some you pay with the life you build afterward. She kept one tradition above all the others. Every Saturday morning before the shop opened to the public, Tavi taught a free class in the back kitchen for anyone from the 7th Ward who wanted to learn. Teenagers with restless hands, grown women starting over, an old man who had always wanted to make his late wife's pie crust right. She taught them to fold gum paste and to read the humidity in a room, but mostly she taught them the thing her mother had taught her, that the work of your hands is worth the moment you decide it does, and that nobody, however fine their name, gets to vote on your dignity. She was passing the dynasty forward one pair of hands at a time, the way it had always been passed. Across town, the Garden District house went up for sale that same autumn, discreetly, with no sign on the lawn and only a single line in a private listing. The old money had finally run all the way out, and the columns that had announced the Rutherford name for 4 generations now belonged to someone else. There were no society pages crowing about Caroline's wedding, no glossy spread of the marriage that had been served on supermarket sponge. The story of that night had traveled the city in whispers, and the whispers had not been kind. Tavi never gloated about any of it. She had learned long ago that when you carry yourself with dignity, you do not have to chase down the people who doubted you. Life tends to settle those accounts on its own. Terrence Calloway still came for chicory coffee, though now he came to her shop, and now he came in the good coat as often as the gray one. She always kept a pot up for him, black with 1 sugar, the way Delphine had taken it for 29 years. He had stopped disappearing on Tuesday mornings to feel like a person, because somewhere along the way he had remembered that the trick was never the disguise. It was simply finding the rooms where people still saw each other plainly. He had found one in a grocery store bakery, and now it had a gold-lettered name on Magazine Street, and the Crescent Foundation sourced every dessert it served from the woman his late wife would have adored. On the night before the grand opening, after Andre had gone home and the last tray had cooled, Tavi stayed behind alone in the quiet shop. She took 2 framed objects from the box she had carried from apartment to apartment for years. The first was her culinary diploma, the one that proved a Swiss perfectionist had once declared her excellent. The second was her mother's last letter, the words about the crown, and the bayou pressed behind glass at last. She hung the diploma on the wall behind the register. Then she hung the letter beside it, slightly higher, where the morning light would find it first. She stood back and looked at the two of them together, the certificate that the world had given her, and the truth her mother had given her, and she understood that only one of them had ever really mattered. A small framed photograph of Erline Toussaint sat on the shelf below, smiling in her church hat the way she always had. Tavi touched 2 fingers to her own lips and then to the glass. "You were right, Mama," she said softly to the empty room. It was a crown the whole time. Then she turned off the lights, locked the door of the bakery she owned with her name on it, and walked out into a New Orleans evening that finally, after all these years, knew exactly what her hands were worth. She had lost a cake and a paycheck and very nearly a dream, all in a single afternoon. She had gotten back something the Rutherfords of the world could never take and had never understood. The quiet woman behind the counter, the one they looked straight through, had been carrying a crown the entire time. She had simply been waiting for a room worthy of seeing it. Octavia Toussaint is not a real person, but she is stitched together from millions who are. Right now, an estimated 100 million Americans are carrying some form of medical debt, and medical bills remain one of the leading triggers of personal bankruptcy in this country, often striking families who were insured the entire time. Meanwhile, the federal minimum wage has not risen above 7.25 an hour since 2009, which means there are extraordinarily gifted people quietly icing supermarket cakes at this very moment, their real worth invisible to almost everyone who passes by. I wrote Tavi because I have met her, in different aprons and different cities more times than I can count. I gave her a happy ending because the real ones so rarely get told. But the dignity in this story is not invented. That part, the part where a person decides their own value when the world refuses to, I have seen with my own eyes, and it is the truest thing in here. If you are one of them, reading this between shifts, I see you, and your hands are worth far more than the world has told you. Now I want to hear from you because a story like this one is really only finished when it lands in a real life. Have you ever been the quietest person in the room, the one people underestimated, the one who kept your composure while someone tried to make you small? Did you keep your receipts, literally or otherwise? And did the truth eventually come out the way it did for Tavi? Or are you in the hard middle of it right now, doing honest work for far less than you are worth, wondering if anyone will ever see what your hands can do? Whatever the answer is, I would be honored to read it. Tell me your story down in the comments, the city you are watching from, and the time on your clock right now, so I know where in the world this one reached you tonight. If this story moved you, even a little, hey, please take 1 second to tap that like button, because it genuinely helps these stories find the people who need them most. If you are new here, consider subscribing and turning on the notification bell, so the next time we sit down to tell a story about quiet strength and earned dignity, you will not miss it. Share this with someone who has ever had to swallow their pride to keep their lights on, someone who needs the reminder that being overlooked is not the same as being worthless. We tell these stories here for one reason, because the world is full of Tavis, full of people whose value is hidden behind a counter or a name tag or a worn gray coat, and every single one of them deserves a room that finally sees them. You never know which tired stranger you pour a little kindness on is carrying a crown of their own. So be the person who keeps the coffee hot. Be the one who looks people in the eye. And remember that the strongest thing in any room is almost never the loudest. Thank you truly for spending this time with me tonight. Until the next story, take care of one another out there. Stay kind, stay blessed, and never underestimate the power of one quiet act of love.